One evening in the late winter of 1973, a 23-year-old mother named Tabby put her 8-month-old son and 2-year-old daughter down for their naps inside of their double-wide trailer, which was parked in a small town in New England. Once her kids fell asleep, Tabby looked over at the clock. She was waiting for her husband to get home from his job as a high school teacher, and he was running late. Tabby wondered, what could be holding up her husband, and she certainly hoped he was okay, but she couldn't just call the high school to ask how he was doing because they didn't own a landline phone. They literally didn't have enough money to afford a landline phone in their trailer. In fact, they basically only had enough money to barely make ends meet. So Tabby and her husband actually had dreams of becoming professional writers. But they had found over the past few years that breaking into writing at this time in America was nearly impossible. They had gotten a few stories published here and there, but for the most part, the only thing their writing had gotten them was a whole bunch of rejection. And so as a result of this, both of them had taken day jobs to basically supplement the income that was not being generated from writing. Tabby was home with the kids, and then in the evening would work some shifts at a Dunkin' Donuts. And then her husband, in addition to being a teacher, also worked at a laundromat. But even with their 3 jobs combined, they barely made any money. Now, Tabby still held on to hope that, maybe one day she could break in and be a professional writer and have that be her primary income. But her husband, who also, had the same dream, was over time becoming increasingly more pessimistic about his opportunity to, one day just be a writer. He sort of felt like this truly was impossible, that they'd struggle forever and he wouldn't become a writer. Tabby walked to the tiny laundry room in the back of their trailer to switch their clothes from the washer to the dryer. So this room, the laundry room, actually doubled as her husband's office. And as soon as she walked back there, she saw his desk was a total mess. All around his typewriter, which sat right in the middle of the table, were all these empty beer cans and food wrappers and rejection letters from various magazines and publications. And the trash can next to the table on the ground was overflowing with crumpled up pieces of paper. Feeling very annoyed by this mess, Tabby reached down to tie up the trash bag to take it outside. But as she went to do that, she happened to glance at one of these crumpled up pieces of paper in the trash, and she skimmed a couple of sentences that were written on it, that were typed on this paper. And as soon as she did, she stopped because there was something really interesting about this writing. Now, she knew her husband had written whatever was on this page, but generally speaking, her husband always shared with her anything he had written, and she would read everything. And there was something about this text that she knew she had not read it before. Like, this was different. Clearly he wrote it, but she had not seen this before, and so she was curious. So she pulled the paper out of the trash can and smoothed it off, and actually began reading what turned out to be this failed manuscript that her husband had thrown away, and she couldn't believe how good it was. And so it dawned on Tabby that clearly her husband had been working on this in secret, which made her wonder, one, why are you doing that? Why are you hiding this particular thing from me when you let me read everything else? And 2, again, this is so good. Why is it crumpled up and in the trash? Just then, Tabby heard the front door of the trailer open and her husband come inside. And so Tabby just took the page she was reading and walked out of the laundry room, and she held it up to her husband and she was like, "What is this? Why haven't you shown me this?" And to Tabby's surprise, her husband, when he realized what she was holding, just looked totally embarrassed, like he wished she hadn't seen that. And she said to him, "No, this is so good. What's going on here?" And her husband would tell her, "Look, I started writing this thing, I didn't really know what it was going to become, but I quickly realized that I don't know enough about the subject matter, and, I'm just not talented enough to finish the story, and even if I was, this is too weird, it's too out there, no one would publish this." And so ultimately, he had just thrown it away and not told Tabby. And in fact, he went on to tell Tabby that in addition to this being a failed project, he really understood at this point in his career that he was a failed writer. And right now, what he really needed to do was give up writing altogether and just focus on making money for the family, something they desperately needed. Tabby could see her husband was completely serious. And so she just held up this piece of paper and she said, "No, this is the one. This is the one that's going to help you break through. I know it. And you know what? Even if you don't know the subject matter, I do. I can help you with that. And together, we can make this a full-length novel. You got to see it through. It's too good not to." And so, at Tabby's insistence, that's what her husband did. He would spend several months working with Tabby to finish this novel, and by the spring of 1974, it was done. And so, that same spring, they began shopping the manuscript around to different publishers, really having no idea how anybody was going to react. But they were both totally blown away when one of the major publishers they sent this thing to came back and said, not only will we absolutely print this book, but we'll also give you a $400,000 advance, which in today's money is $2.5 million. A massive, massive book deal by any standard. And so the young couple was totally thrilled. They took the book deal, the book got published, and with the money they got, they were able to move out of their double-wide trailer, and they were able to purchase a landline telephone. But that was only the beginning. Tabby's decision to pull that crumpled up piece of paper out of the trash can and force her husband to turn it into a novel would prove to be a good one, because her husband would go on to become arguably one of the most famous writers in the world. That story that Tabby saved from the trash can would go on to become the iconic horror novel Carrie. Tabby's husband was none other than Stephen King. On the afternoon of July 29, 2016, a 23-year-old college student named Felix stood in the break room of the industrial manufacturing company where he worked in northwestern Germany. He poured some cereal into a bowl, and then he took his carton of milk out of the communal fridge, and then with the cereal and his milk, he sat down at a table with two of his coworkers. So Felix was studying to become an engineer, and that was his primary focus. And on his breaks from school, he would work here as a machine mechanic. But as a result of that, basically just being a college kid looking for a side gig, it made him one of the youngest people at this company. And so oftentimes, Felix had a hard time relating to his coworkers, who were all basically a lot older than him. And in fact, now, as he sat down to eat his cereal, the two coworkers that were sitting there already, these two men named Otto and Klaus, who were in their 50s, it's like they didn't even look up and acknowledge him. They just continued silently eating their sandwiches as if Felix wasn't even there. At first, Felix put up with the fact that this lunch break so far was pretty awkward. Like there was no conversation happening here. He definitely felt like he did not belong here. But eventually, the silence was deafening at this table, and Felix just couldn't stand it. And so he said to his coworkers, Klaus and Otto, hey guys, how's the day going? And Klaus looked up and stared at Felix, and he just shrugged, said nothing, and went back to eating his food. Now, Klaus, admittedly, was known as sort of a loner employee who kind of kept to himself, so this behavior was somewhat normal, although somewhat off-putting to Felix, who's trying to obviously start a conversation here. But then Otto, he looked up, and he looked at Felix, and he was about to say something, but then paused, and this grimace came over his face, and he just said to Felix, you know what? I'm not having a good day. My head hurts, my stomach hurts, I feel tired, I feel kind of awful. And so now Felix is like, okay, sorry, Otto, I don't know what to tell you, that's tough. And then the three men just kind of went back to eating and back to silence. Now, Felix didn't know how to make this any less awkward, and so he just went back to eating his cereal in silence, and then when he was done, he got up and left the awkward break room. But Felix had only been back to his job for a couple of minutes when suddenly he felt this intense stomach cramp that made him double over in pain. Now, Felix actually was somewhat accustomed to getting cramps like this one because he was lactose intolerant. And typically, if he consumed dairy shortly thereafter, he would get these stabbing pains in his stomach. That's actually why he kept a carton of his own milk in the communal fridge that was lactose-free. And so suddenly, Felix wondered if maybe he had accidentally grabbed the wrong milk when he had poured his cereal just now. Had he grabbed regular milk, causing this pain? And so as a wave of nausea came over him, Felix sprinted back into the break room, opened up the communal fridge to see if he had grabbed the wrong milk, but he saw there was actually only one container of milk in the fridge, and it was his, the lactose-free kind. And so he had no idea what was actually causing these cramps because it couldn't have been dairy. But at this point, Felix was just so nauseous that all he could think about now was the fact that he could no longer work today. He had to go home. And so Felix told his supervisor he had to go, and then he rushed out to his car, he sped home, and barely made it into his bathroom in time in order to vomit into the toilet. And after he vomited, he felt a little bit better, and so he wiped his mouth, and he stood up straight, took a deep breath, and then he went to the sink and he splashed some water on his face, and he grabbed the towel and he went to dry his face, and as he did, he noticed something. He noticed the tips of his fingers were now tingling, like his hands were going numb. And so reflexively, he put down the hand towel and began flexing and opening and closing his hands over and over again to increase the circulation to his fingers, to maybe get the feeling back. But nothing he did seemed to help. And at this point, Felix couldn't help but feel a little bit scared. Now, stomach cramps and nausea were somewhat normal symptoms for him, considering, again, he was lactose intolerant. Those were normal symptoms of illness. But losing circulation in your hands was not something he was used to. This was something else. And so even though Felix was an adult, he was 23 years old, his first thought was, I gotta call my mom. And so that's what he did. 2 weeks later, Felix was still sick. On his mother's advice, he had gone to see his doctor, and his doctor had told him that he was very likely just overworked, and he prescribed Felix some vitamins and rest. But those two things had not helped Felix. In fact, really, his symptoms had only gotten worse. He was still nauseous, and that tingling feeling he had felt in his hands had now extended all the way up into his forearms. And so as a result of this mystery illness afflicting Felix, he had not been able to go back to work, and he had spent the better part of the last 2 weeks just lying miserably in bed. But this morning, he was determined to get out of bed, take a shower, have a real meal, and basically just have a normal day. And so it started relatively well. He managed to, prop himself up and get out of bed. But as he staggered his way towards the bathroom, he lost his balance and had to grab onto the door to keep from falling to the ground. After steadying himself, Felix did attempt to keep walking towards the bathroom, but it was like the commands from his brain were not reaching his legs. And so he kept slipping and staggering and almost falling. And so eventually he just turned around to go back to bed, but immediately he kind of collapsed to the ground and had to literally crawl painstakingly back to the bed. And then when he had finally pulled himself back on there, he pulled out his phone and called his mom again. But this time, he was not calling for advice. He was calling for help. He needed her to drive him to the hospital. Later that afternoon, Felix laid in a hospital bed with his mother to his left and an emergency room neurologist to his right. The neurologist had heard about Felix's symptoms, and she was now performing a preliminary examination, which really consisted of lots of questions about Felix's drug use, about, a history of neurological problems in their family, had he had any recent head injuries. But basically all the questions she was asking him, he said no to. There weren't any precursors to him having these issues. Next, the neurologist poked Felix's arms to see what he could feel, because he was complaining of numbness and tingling. But it was kind of like wherever she poked in his arms, he couldn't really feel it. It was like the tingling sensation had totally taken over both arms. That's all he could feel. After that, she measured his muscle reflexes in his legs and also shined a light in both his eyes. And then after that, she put her tools down and she looked at Felix with a very worried expression on her face. She said that based on Felix's symptoms, she thought that some part of his nervous system, like his brain or his spinal cord, might be inflamed. And this type of inflammation can lead to things like nausea, numbness, and loss of coordination, all things Felix had been experiencing. And this inflammation could be caused by a number of different infections or an autoimmune reaction. But to know for sure, she would have to run some more tests. And so she advised Felix to be admitted to the hospital. 6 days later, the neurologist went to check in on Felix, who was still at the hospital. And as soon as she walked into his room and saw Felix, she saw he looked terrible. His body was limp, his face was swollen, and his eyes were sort of glazed over, like he was staring off into the distance. By this point, doctors had run imaging scans on Felix and had discovered that his brain and brainstem were inflamed, like the neurologist had suspected. But the neurologist could not figure out why this was happening. Typically, inflammation like this was caused by an infection. But the neurologist had tested Felix for every infection she could think of that could have caused this, and all those tests had come back negative. So her new working theory was Felix must be having an extreme autoimmune reaction, which is basically when your immune system malfunctions and starts attacking your own body. Autoimmune reactions can cause things like brain swelling. But this theory didn't really help Felix very much, because first of all, it was nearly impossible to test to see if this theory was even true, that it was an autoimmune reaction. And second of all, even if you knew that's what it was, unfortunately, autoimmune reactions are notoriously difficult to treat. Basically, it was a shaky diagnosis that did not come with an easy cure. The neurologist had given Felix some anti-inflammatory medication, hoping that maybe that would help, based on her research around autoimmune diseases, but it basically did nothing. And she knew that if she didn't find a way to lower the swelling in his brain and brainstem, that Felix could potentially suffer permanent brain damage or even death. So now, in Felix's hospital room, The neurologist walked over to him and tapped his shoulder, and she asked him how he was feeling. And Felix, when he sort of looked up at her, his eyes were rolled back in his skull, and it took a minute for him to focus on her. And then it was clear to the neurologist that it took all of his energy to croak out an answer. But the words he said didn't make any sense. He said, "metal, mouth." And the neurologist said, "What? Like, what are you trying to say?" And then he said, "taste, water." And at that point, the neurologist realized what Felix was trying to say is that he had a metallic taste in his mouth and he wanted a cup of water to clear his mouth. The neurologist felt like this had to be a clue about what was going on with Felix. It was not some random symptom, like this has to be connected to the totality of what was wrong with him. But she didn't know what a metallic taste in his mouth had to do with his other symptoms. And so she was baffled. So she just grabbed a cup of water off the nearby table and handed it to Felix. And Felix immediately put it to his lips and tried to drink it. But it was like he couldn't, and the water just dribbled down his chin onto his chest. And as the neurologist stared at her patient, she couldn't help but feel like she was just totally failing here. I mean, obviously there was something horribly wrong with Felix, but she had not come up with a proper diagnosis yet. And all the medications and treatments she had suggested so far had done nothing for his symptoms. And she knew if she couldn't get the swelling to go down, it was just a matter of time before he suffered permanent brain damage or death. And so at this point, the neurologist realized a big change would have to be made in Felix's care. Clearly what she was doing was not working. And so she decided to transfer him from her hospital to a local university hospital where she knew there were some specialists there who they might be able to figure out what was going on here. But the next day at that university hospital, that team of specialists that had been assigned to Felix's case were just as baffled as the neurologist had been. Because now Felix didn't just have swelling in his brain and a metallic taste in his mouth. He also was experiencing kidney and liver failure. And this collection of symptoms meant Felix very likely did not have an autoimmune condition. They tested him again for more infections that, maybe could still leave the possibility open that it was an autoimmune condition. But again, those still all came back negative. And so effectively, these specialists who were here to, solve this puzzle were back at square one. They had made no further progress. And so at this point, all Felix's doctors could do was just hope that whatever illness was plaguing Felix would sort of resolve itself on its own. And they would just, do their best to manage his symptoms and try to keep him comfortable until it did. However, by September of 2016, so 2 months after that first day that Felix went home sick from work, he had not improved. He spent most of his time laying in bed unconscious, barely clinging to life. At this point, most of these specialists were just monitoring Felix. However, one of them still felt like a diagnosis here was still possible. We just need to keep looking. And so this doctor actually decided that instead of monitoring Felix, he was going to start looking into some medical research papers because he figured, whatever Felix had to be really, really rare. If it wasn't, they would have figured it out by now, and they clearly had not. So he must have something rare. And if there's one place you can go to learn about very rare conditions and diseases, it's medical research papers. And so he began combing through all these papers, and sure enough, he would actually find a case about another patient who had the exact same symptoms as Felix, and they even appeared in the exact same order. First, the stomach cramps and nausea, followed by the tingling in the arms, then the loss of coordination in the legs, then the swelling of the brain, followed by the metallic taste in the mouth, and then ultimately kidney and liver failure. And just like Felix, this patient's diagnosis in this medical journal was not an infection, nor was it an autoimmune disease. Instead, it was a condition that was so rare, it had only been recorded 3 times anywhere in the world over the last century. But this doctor understood that even though Felix's symptoms did appear to match, it still was highly unlikely he actually had this diagnosis because it's so unbelievably rare. However, the doctor thought, well, I'll just rule this condition out. All I need to do is a simple blood test. And so he did this blood test on Felix, literally believing it would just rule this out, except when the results came back, it was positive. This doctor had just solved the case, the one that nobody else seemed able to do. But the doctor was not happy. Instead, as he stared at the test results, he was kind of horrified because this diagnosis was a death sentence for Felix. There was no cure for this. And worse, this diagnosis meant other people potentially could be in danger here. And so the doctor knew his next step, of course, would be to contact Felix's family and tell them what he had discovered. But he also knew this was no longer just a medical problem. The doctor called local law enforcement, and they began their investigation immediately. They interviewed basically everyone Felix ever interacted with on a regular basis, and they also sent forensic technicians to all the places that Felix spent any time. And these technicians ran tests on all the surfaces that Felix might have touched at one point or another. They also ran tests on the food and the water that he might have consumed. They even at one point tried to test the air that Felix had potentially breathed. And they did all this because they were trying to find one very specific substance. But despite basically looking everywhere in Felix's life for weeks and weeks, they didn't find it. Meanwhile, Felix's condition only got worse. By the end of September, he had slipped into a vegetative state. But at least so far, the doctor's worst fears had not been realized. They actually expected other people to begin to turn up to hospitals with similar symptoms as Felix. But they hadn't. So, with no answers, but with no other victims either, the police investigation began to wind down. Felix remained in a vegetative state for months and then years, and officials still just had no idea how this actually happened to him. And they just kind of concluded that, well, this was a horrible tragedy that very likely will never actually be explained. But at least hopefully it will never happen to anyone else. But then, 2 years after Felix fell into his coma, some very strange things began to happen at his old manufacturing job. So at this manufacturing company where Felix used to work, it actually was pretty commonplace for employees there to get sick fairly regularly, like more than normal. However, their illnesses were sort of basic. Things like headaches and stomach aches and feeling sort of tired, things that didn't really raise big red flags. But now, Otto, the middle-aged man who had complained to Felix over their lunch break about his stomach and his head hurting, was going into kidney failure. And in fact, he was so sick he couldn't come to work anymore and had to get dialysis 3 times a week just to live. And also, another much younger employee, whose name was Elias, he was 26 years old, he had begun having stomach aches. Now, again, that was fairly common at this company, but for Elias, these were not normal stomach aches. These were crippling, severe, like you can't focus on anything else type of stomach aches, similar to the ones Felix was having. Now, Otto and Elias had not spoken to each other about their respective illnesses. This was a place where people just kind of got sick periodically and kept it to themselves. It was just not really that big of a deal. So they hadn't talked to each other, and they certainly had not connected what was happening to them to Felix and his illness, which was now over 2 years before. But that would all change one day in May of 2018, so again, we're still talking about 2 years since Felix went into his coma, when Elias was having his lunch in the company break room, and he would discover something that would connect everything and blow this case wide open. Elias's shocking discovery led police to do a search of a local home. And at first, this home seemed totally ordinary until they went down into the basement. Because down there, it looked like a mad scientist's laboratory. There was this metal table with all these beakers and scales on it, and then behind it were all these shelves that were stacked high with old jam jars and paint cans and even old mayonnaise bottles. And it would turn out, inside of these mismatched containers was a collection of deadly chemicals that a judge would later say were more toxic and more deadly than the literal chemical weapons that were used during World War I. This basement laboratory belonged to Klaus. He was one of the 2 employees that Felix sat with during that very awkward lunch break. The one was Otto, who told Felix he didn't feel very good, and the other was Klaus, the man who, when asked how his day was going, just looked up at Felix, shrugged his shoulders, and said nothing. It would turn out, for years, Klaus had been buying deadly chemicals online, mixing them together, and then sort of testing these concoctions on his coworkers. He would just poison their lunches and see what happened. Felix's very rare disease that only 3 people had experienced in the past century in the whole world was effectively extremely acute mercury poisoning. Basically, an ungodly high level of mercury poisoning. Because Klaus was literally just putting mercury into Felix's cereal, and he was just eating it up. In addition to poisoning Felix's cereal, Klaus also put lead literally right on top of Elias's sandwiches, and then he also put a combination of lead and cadmium into Otto's food. Klaus was only caught because Elias made that big discovery. While he was eating his lunch, he noticed there was a strange powder sitting on top of his sandwich, and so he called the police. Klaus never explained his motives for the poisonings. In March of 2019, he was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And unfortunately, 10 months after that, Felix, who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years to that point, passed away. As for Elias and Otto, they still suffer from long-term effects of chemical poisoning. On the evening of December 29, 1986, a California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre drove his cruiser down Interstate 15 in San Diego, California. With him was an NBC News reporter in the back seat, and there was a cameraman in the passenger seat. They were filming a segment about highway travel safety that was set to air on the evening news later that night. Officer Pyre was following his typical patrol route, but after a few minutes, they passed by a sign that said Mercy Road. It was an exit, and at that point, Officer Pyre turned to the news team, pointed at Mercy Road, and said, "That's where they found the body." So a little more than 36 hours earlier, at around 4 a.m. the previous morning, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a creek right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been on her way home from her boyfriend's house when, for whatever reason, maybe car troubles or maybe she was trying to help someone, but she wound up in that cul-de-sac, and then while she was there, she clearly encountered someone dangerous who took her life. And so this was actually why the California Highway Patrol and NBC News were collaborating on this news segment, because Kara's killer was still not caught. And so the idea behind this segment was basically to tell drivers along this highway, how to stay safe while they were out there, especially if for whatever reason they had to stop somewhere along the highway, what to do in that situation. And so as Officer Pyre passed by the Mercy Road exit and continued down Interstate 15, he turned to the news crew, and as they filmed, he began talking about the basics of highway travel safety. Specifically, he said, look, one of the most hazardous things that can happen to you beyond an accident on the highway is if you have some sort of car trouble that forces you to stop on the highway. Because once you stop, there's an inclination for a lot of people to want to leave their vehicle. But that's a very dangerous thing to do.
Anything could happen. Being a female, you could be raped, robbed if you're a male, all the way to where you could be killed.
Officer Pyre also warned people not to get into a stranger's car, because there was a running theory at this point that perhaps Kara had gotten into her killer's car. As this particular segment was filmed, the one you just watched, Officer Pyre was looking ahead, and he noticed there was a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazards on. So he turned to the news crew and basically said, look, here's a chance for us to actually show the people in real time what to do in case your car breaks down on the highway. So he pulled his cruiser over right behind the stalled car, he got out, and then gestured for the news crew to come with him. Officer Pyre walked over to the passenger side door of this car, and through the open window, he asked the driver to get out and talk to him. The driver did, and as the camera rolled, Officer Pyre asked him to explain, what's going on here, what happened to your car. The driver said he had run out of gas and then gotten stranded on the side of the road. And then he had left his car and walked to a gas station to get a gas can, came all the way back, he put the gas into his car, but his car still wouldn't start. Now, at this point, Officer Pyre is realizing that this driver is doing basically exactly what he shouldn't be doing, according to the safety tips Officer Pyre had given. And so on camera, he basically says to this guy, do you understand how dangerous it is to have left your car like that and walked alone on this highway? Do you understand what a hazard that is? And the driver just kind of looked at him and shrugged yeah, I guess so. After that, Officer Pyre called the man a tow truck. His car was towed and the man was on his way. And Officer Pyre got back into the cruiser with the news crew and they carried on. After that, Officer Pyre and the news crew wrapped up filming. And then after he dropped them back off again, they told him what time to expect his segment to air on NBC that night. And sure enough, that evening, Officer Pyre was in front of a TV as the broadcast started. And when Officer Pyre's actual segment aired on TV, to him and to the California Highway Patrol, it went great. It was 1.5 minutes long. It sort of hit all the high points. It showed Officer Pyre, talking about how to be safe on the highway and talking to the stranded motorist. It kind of did exactly what they expected it to do. And when it was over, Officer Pyre clicked off the TV and didn't think much about it, because it was not a big deal. It was just a basic safety video. And for the vast majority of other people who watched this clip live on TV, it really didn't stand out to them. Again, it was just kind of a routine police safety video. But there were a few people, when they watched this clip, that noticed something very specific. And within an hour of this clip airing on TV, those few people were calling the police in droves to tell them, "We know what happened to Kara Knott." And the police would follow up on these tips. And sure enough, just over 2 weeks later, they had gathered enough evidence that they were able to arrest Kara Knott's killer. It would turn out all the clues the police needed to solve the Kara Knott murder case were right there in that 1.5-minute long video. Because what happened to Kara had almost happened to over 24 other women in San Diego. And those young women were the ones who saw the news segment when it happened live, and they noticed this particular detail that clearly telegraphed who Kara's killer was. They were the ones who called police. On the night of Kara's murder, December 27th, 1986, she pulled off Interstate 15 on the Mercy Road exit, and she came to a stop in that cul-de-sac. Now, we don't know exactly why she came to a stop in there, but either way, she was there, and that's where she encountered her killer. Now, the other 24 women who encountered the same person, the killer, they were terrorized and kind of tortured and held hostage for a couple of hours, but eventually were let go. But Kara wasn't. During her encounter, at some point, the killer clubbed her over the head and then strangled her to death with a rope. Now, the killer, at first, had gotten away with this, until they were featured on that 1.5-minute long video. And some of those women who had survived their attack, they're watching the segment, and suddenly their attacker is on TV. Now, they had previously reported their attack to police, but to this point, nothing had been done. And now they're staring at, for sure, the person who attacked them, who's right on TV. And critically, as part of this segment, they're hearing about how this other young woman had been attacked and killed on this highway. And they're thinking, oh, this person did that to me. I barely got away. I bet they killed this girl. And on top of that, as they're watching the news, staring at their attacker, they can see there's a fresh cut over their eye. And so put that all together and they thought, boom, that's the person who killed Kara Knott. And sure enough, the police would follow up on these tips and they would confirm that the man in the video with the cut over his eyebrow was Kara's killer. And Kara's killer was none other than Officer Craig Pyre. Officer Pyre was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Since being incarcerated, he has gone up for parole 2 separate times and been rejected both times. However, he is up for parole again in 2027. One evening in the late 1980s, a man in his 20s named Norm walked into a house party in the Hollywood Hills, which is a very exclusive and pricey neighborhood in Los Angeles, California. In this house, which was filled with people, there were all these actors and entertainers and Hollywood-type people, and Norm, who was this kind of scruffy guy with long stringy hair and who had no experience in the entertainment industry, knew he did not fit in here at all. In fact, Norm never would have been at a party like this, if not for what had happened to him just a few hours earlier. So that afternoon, Norm had gotten into a fight with his boss at the motorcycle shop where he worked. Now, Norm and his boss never got along, but they managed to coexist for the most part, except today, this small argument had turned into a huge argument that turned into Norm getting fired. And so after getting fired, Norm left the shop and just began aimlessly walking around Los Angeles until he wound up running into one of his friends. And over the course of this conversation where Norm's like, yeah, I got fired, not doing too good, the friend was like, oh, well, tonight there's gonna be this big party up in the Hollywood Hills. Why don't you come along? And Norm, who was feeling admittedly pretty down after being fired, decided, you know what the heck? I'll go to this party because maybe that will boost my spirits. And so now here he was. And so Norm went and found his friend in the house party. And for a little while, the party was pretty great. I mean, Norm felt kind of uncomfortable, didn't really know anybody. It was kind of awkward, but it was fine. Him and his friend were drinking and chatting, and his friend was introducing him to some people, and it was all good. Except Norm just couldn't shake the anger he felt about getting fired. Not only at the fact that he was now unemployed, which was a huge problem, but he also just felt mad at his boss. Like, how dare his boss do this to him? And so to cope with this, Norm just began drinking really heavily, like way more than anybody else at this party. And before long, Norm was completely plastered drunk. But it would turn out, getting totally smashed did not calm Norm down. In fact, if anything, it only made him more blind with rage about what had happened to him. And so naturally what he did is he departs his friend and pushes through the crowd of people, and he goes up to the second floor where there was this balcony that overlooked where basically everybody in the house was. And Norm, who's slurring his speech and he's totally a mess, he screams out to the crowd of these people that he doesn't even know, these Hollywood people, basically screams at them to stop what they're doing and listen to him. And everyone did. They turned around and looked up at this guy like, what's going on here? And Norm just begins delivering this totally angry rant that kind of didn't even make any sense. I mean, he's drunk, but he's basically ranting about how mad he is and this horrible injustice that's been done to him, and just on and on. He's just pouring out all of his emotions, and everybody's just kind of looking at him like, what is going on here? It was like a train wreck, you know? They couldn't look away. Eventually, Norman finished up his big, rambling, humiliating speech, and he stepped away from the railing, and everybody down below who, had been wrapped to this point, but now was kind of like, whatever. They went back to the party, and Norm just stood up there kind of taking in the scene, and suddenly he felt a tap on his shoulder. And he turned around and he saw there was this person he didn't recognize, and this person says to Norm, "Hey, have you ever considered acting in a play?" It would turn out that person was a Hollywood producer, and they were putting on a play in LA. And they really liked Norm's look, the whole kind of scruffy vibe, but even more as they watched him deliver that totally angry, drunken rant that he managed to get all these people to listen to, that it was obvious he had natural charisma and he could command an audience even when the audience had no idea what he was talking about. And so ultimately, this producer literally offered Norm an acting job, and Norm, who really didn't have aspirations to be an actor, but now needed a job because he had just been fired that day, he's unemployed, he agreed. He said, "Okay, I'll act in your play." And so Norman would act in this play, and he would do such a good job, despite the fact that he totally was not an actor. He literally was a drunk guy at a party who randomly got recognized by some producer. But regardless, he acts in this play, and he is such a natural and does such a good job that he gets noticed by other Hollywood producers and casting directors. And before long, he lands his starring role in the mega hit TV show, The Walking Dead. Norm's full name is Norman Reedus. At 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945, a 13-year-old girl named Barbara Kent was sleeping inside of a cabin in Ruidoso, New Mexico, where she was staying for a sleepover summer dance camp. And as she slept, suddenly there was this loud booming sound that literally shook her awake and actually caused her to fall out of her bed onto the floor. Barbara sat up feeling totally confused, and she looked around the cabin and she saw the 9 other girls that were also here for the sleepover camp. They too were wide awake, and some of them also had fallen onto the floor. And so the girls, they're all freaking out. They're looking at each other like, what's going on here? What was that? And as this kind of pandemonium is ensuing, their lead dance instructor came running into the cabin and told the girls that she thought one of the cabin's heaters had exploded and that potentially there could be a fire somewhere on the camp. And so all the girls, they're already totally panicked. Now they're getting really scared. And the instructor's just like, all right, girls, go outside, stand by the river. I'm gonna go find wherever this explosion happened and make sure everything is okay. And so the girls, they were led outside, totally a mess, and they went and stood by this river near the cabin and waited for their instructor to go look around. And so Barbara and the 9 other girls, they're totally terrified, and they're standing by this riverbank, and they're kind of looking around the property, seeing if they can see smoke or fire, but they can't. And as they're standing there waiting for their instructor to come back, Barbara felt something hit the tip of her nose, and it was cold and soft. And she looked up and she realized it was snowing. But it's July in New Mexico. It should not be snowing. But sure enough, snow was coming down from the sky. And as the snow came down on Barbara, she looked at the other girls, and they too were looking up and putting their hands up and letting the snow hit them in the face. They couldn't believe it. I mean, this was like a totally rare weather event. And so a minute later, their dance instructor came back and told the girls that, she looked all over the camp and there did not appear to be a fire or an explosion of any kind, that everything seemed fine. They didn't know what that loud sound was, but, by all accounts, it seemed safe here. And so the girls were very relieved to hear this, but already their attention had completely shifted to the snow. I mean, again, it's July in New Mexico. There shouldn't be snow. And so the girls, they turned to their instructor and they're like, okay, well, now that it's safe, would it be okay if we put on our bathing suits and just went swimming in the river while it snowed on us? I mean, this is incredible. And the instructor, who to this point had really been focused on finding the fire and the hazard or whatever, now that she knew things were safe, she kind of took in the scene and also suddenly appreciated how unbelievable it was that there was snow coming down. And so she told the girls, yeah, get your bathing suits, go swimming, enjoy this. This is totally like a once in a lifetime moment here. And so very excitedly, Barbara and the other girls ran back into the cabin, they changed into their swimwear, and then a moment later, they were out frolicking in the river as the snow fell on top of them. And for hours, they just played in the river and enjoyed the snow. And the snow was kind of building up on the riverbanks. And so some of the girls went over and scooped it up and rubbed it on their faces and, made snowballs. And they just had a great time. And at one point, the dance instructor came by and actually took a picture of Barbara, who was right in the middle of the river enjoying this bizarre scene. But eventually, despite how fun the snow was, the novelty of it all sort of wore off and the girls got tired of swimming. So they changed into their regular clothes and went about their day. And over the course of the next few days, summer camp went as normal. The girls had a great time, and when summer camp ended, all the girls went home. Now, the girls never got an explanation for why it had snowed. They all just assumed it was some super rare weather event that they had been lucky enough to experience. Until 17 years later, when Barbara was 30 years old at this point, and she learned that all the other girls she had gone to the dance camp with had died. One by one, each of those girls were diagnosed with aggressive forms of cancer that killed them. Barbara was the only one who was spared. And she wouldn't get any clarification as to why that had happened until decades later in 2006, when Barbara was in her 70s, when the government finally came out and admitted the truth. It would turn out Barbara's dance instructor was correct in thinking there had been an explosion on July 16, 1945. But of course, it was not any of the cabin's heaters or anything local to the cabin or the camp. Instead, the explosion occurred 40 miles away at a US government testing site in the middle of the New Mexico desert. And the explosion that literally caused the girls to be dumped out of their beds was from the world's first ever atomic bomb being dropped. It was the Manhattan Project's Trinity test, a test that no civilians in the area had been warned about. And so after this bomb detonated, there was this nuclear fallout that rained from the sky on 500,000 people that lived within a 150-mile radius of the detonation site. And within those 500,000 people were those 10 innocent teenage girls at their dance camp. The snow that the girls played in was actually radioactive material from this nuclear fallout raining down from the sky that over the course of 17 years would give 9 of the girls various forms of cancer that would kill them. Here is the picture that the dance instructor took of Barbara posing in the middle of the river as the snow is falling all around her. As you can see, Barbara is smiling and looking up at the snow, not realizing it's literally going to kill almost everyone in that picture. As for Barbara, she did not die young. However, she would suffer from multiple cancers and illnesses, all associated with radiation exposure. One late night in the summer of 1974, a 30-year-old man named Fred stood inside of a loud casino in Las Vegas, feeling incredibly nervous. He knew what he was about to do was a horrible idea. In fact, he didn't even know if he had the guts to try it. Fred grabbed a huge wad of cash out of his pocket, and as he looked at it, he thought about the reason he was here. So Fred had actually flown to Las Vegas on a whim after a bad meeting with a group of investors. So Fred had founded this small company 3 years earlier, and he really needed a loan from these investors, but they had said no. Fred had actually already lost over $13 million to this point, and so the investors said, look, like your track record is not good enough, we're not giving you any more money. And this was a huge problem for Fred, because right now, in all of his company accounts, he had a total of $5,000. And at a minimum, he needed to pay his fuel bill for his company, which was $24,000. And that bill was due soon, so he didn't have enough money to cover it. And besides the fuel bill, he also didn't have any money to make payroll. So basically, Fred did not have any more money. And if he didn't find a way to find more money, he would have to file for bankruptcy, shut his business down, and lay off all of his employees. And so Fred really couldn't think of a worse fate here. He totally believed in this company. I mean, this was his baby. He'd invested all of his inheritance into it. But now it was about to collapse, unless he got really, really lucky. All around him in the casino, Fred could see gamblers hunched over slot machines and over poker tables and blackjack tables, and some people looked elated, like they were having the time of their lives. And many other people looked like they were maybe having the worst time of their lives and were on the brink of tears. Fred didn't know if he'd be celebrating or sobbing by the end of this night. All he knew is he was out of options here. He could either do nothing and just kind of accept his fate, that his business was doomed and would have to be shut down, Or he could do what he was doing tonight, which was to basically take what little cash he had and put it on a game of chance, basically gamble the money he had in hopes of winning enough money to keep his business going a little bit longer. And so after taking a calming breath, Fred began walking over to a blackjack table because someone had told him that of all the games you could play in a Las Vegas casino, the game with the best odds was blackjack. Fred chose a table with an open seat. He exchanged all his cash for chips while he prayed that he was making the right choice here. And then Fred began to play. For the first few hands, Fred was pretty cautious, only placing small bets. But he won all those small bets, and it kind of emboldened him. And so he began placing larger bets, and he began winning those bets too. And in fact, it got to the point where he was winning so consistently that a crowd of strangers had formed behind the table just to watch Fred. But Fred wasn't even aware of the crowd behind him. He was so focused on every single hand. I mean, for him, this was like his life he was gambling with. And eventually, he got to a place where he had like a mountain of chips in front of him, and he was gambling huge sums of it all at once. And then eventually, when he had this big mountain of chips in front of him, Fred decided this was it. He was going to double down and go all in. And so he puts all these chips out and he waits, and eventually the dealer flips over their cards. And as soon as they did, the crowd around Fred, who he hadn't even noticed to this point, erupted in cheers because Fred had just won. And when the dealer pushed all the chips back over to him and he got to count how much money he had, he realized he had started with $5,000, but now had $27,000. He had gambled and won. $27,000 was just enough to pay that fuel bill and keep his company running a little bit longer. So basically exactly what Fred had hoped for had happened. And then during this extra time that Fred had basically won himself, he was able to secure $11 million in investor funding, which was enough money to finally scale up this small business into the behemoth that we know it as today. Fred went from being a guy betting his last chips at a casino to now being a multi-billionaire. Fred's full name is Fred Smith, and that little company that he scaled up on a gamble was FedEx.